Have you ever noticed that some people don't seem disappointed by the world anymore? It's not because life has been easier for them. It's because somewhere along the way, they stopped expecting the world to become something it never was. Most people think trust begins with other people. Psychology says it begins much earlier. It begins with prediction. Every experience whispers the same question to your brain. Should I expect this to happen again? The strange part is, your brain doesn't care whether the experience was fair, only whether it was repeated. Because repetition is how the nervous system defines reality. Not logic. Not opinions. Patterns. That's why two people can live through the same decade and spend the rest of their lives carrying completely different versions of it. One remembers possibility. The other remembers uncertainty. Neither remembers everything. Each remembers what their brain believed was necessary for survival. And here's the uncomfortable thought. What if the person you call yourself is in many ways a collection of predictions your brain stopped questioning years ago? Think about that for a moment. How many opinions do you actually own? And how many are simply old conclusions wearing the mask of personality? That's why this story isn't really about Generation X. It's about anyone who has ever heard themselves say, I guess that's just the way I am. Because those 7 words hide an extraordinary assumption. That who you are today is who you've always been. But psychology tells a different story. You weren't born distrusting people. You weren't born believing you had to handle everything alone. You learned. Quietly. Patiently. One ordinary day at a time. If you enjoy exploring the hidden psychology behind human behavior, subscribe to the channel. Every week, we uncover the invisible patterns that shape our decisions long before we realize they're there. Now imagine you're 10 years old. School is over. You walk home alone. The street is almost silent. You unlock the front door. No one is waiting. No phone buzzes. No message asks where you are. Just an empty house. And the sound of your own footsteps. For many people today, that feels unsettling. For millions of children growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, it felt normal. People remember those years as a time of freedom. They're right. But freedom always teaches 2 lessons. The obvious one is independence. The hidden one is responsibility. Every afternoon spent figuring things out alone was quietly answering a question the brain never stops asking. When life becomes uncertain, who shows up? For Generation X, the answer was often the same. I do. At first, that's just a habit. Then it becomes confidence. Eventually, it becomes identity. This is why independence can be deceptive. It doesn't always begin as courage. Sometimes, it begins as necessity. And there's a profound difference between choosing to stand alone and discovering over and over again that standing alone is simply what works. The human brain loves what works. It repeats it. It protects it. And after enough repetition, it calls it personality. Maybe that's why so many people confuse adaptation with identity. They don't realize that some of the traits they're proudest of were first invented by a younger version of themselves, just trying to feel safe. And once you see that, an even bigger question appears. If independence was learned, what else was? If independence was learned, what else was? Maybe the answer is almost everything. Here's something most people never realize. Children don't learn who to trust by listening. They learn by watching. Not what adults say. What adults repeatedly do. Because words are processed by the conscious mind. Patterns are stored by the nervous system. And the nervous system has one job. Predict what happens next. Imagine 2 children. One grows up hearing, I'm here if you need me. And every single time they reach out, someone comes. The other hears the exact same words. But when life becomes difficult, no one arrives. Both children heard the same promise. Only one brain believed it. Because the brain never asks, what was I told? Asked, what actually happened? That single difference quietly changes an entire life. Perhaps that's why Generation X became experts at watching instead of listening. Not because they expected people to lie. Because experience taught them that actions rarely need translation. A promise tells you what someone hopes to be. A pattern tells you who they are. And patterns are incredibly difficult to fake. That's why trust isn't built during someone's best moments. It's built during ordinary ones. Anyone can be kind when life is easy. Anyone can sound confident when nothing is at risk. Character appears when convenience disappears. Watch what happens when plans fail. When pressure rises. When no one is watching. Those moments reveal something words never can. Because pressure doesn't create character. It exposes it. Generation X understood this long before they could explain it. They stopped measuring people by what they said, and started measuring them by what stayed consistent. Consistency. That's the word. Not perfection. Not charisma. Consistency. The strange thing is, the human brain finds consistency more comforting than excitement. Excitement is unpredictable. Consistency lets the nervous system relax. Maybe that's why some of the safest people you'll ever meet aren't the loudest. They aren't the funniest. They rarely try to impress anyone. They're simply the same person on difficult days as they are on easy ones. And once your brain finds someone like that, it slowly stops scanning for danger. That's what trust really feels like. Not certainty. Rest. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Generation X didn't just become careful about trusting other people. They also became careful about needing other people. Those are completely different things. Think about the sentence you've probably heard someone say. Don't worry. I'll handle it. It sounds responsible, even admirable. But listen to what it's quietly hiding. If I carry it myself, I can't be disappointed by someone else. That's not confidence. That's protection disguised as competence. And once that strategy works a few hundred times, the brain stops seeing it as a strategy. It starts calling it maturity. This is why some of the strongest people you know are also the hardest to help. Not because they don't appreciate support, because receiving support feels unfamiliar. And the brain is naturally cautious around what feels unfamiliar. There's a question almost nobody asks. What happens when the child who learned to solve everything alone becomes the adult everyone depends on? At first, they feel capable. Then, they feel responsible. Eventually, they feel indispensable. And that's a dangerous place to live, because indispensable people often forget something essential. Who carries them? The strongest person in the room is often the one everyone assumes is fine. Not because they are, because they've become so skilled at hiding the weight they carry. Maybe that's why emotional exhaustion rarely announces itself. It whispers. It sounds like, it's easier if I just do it myself. And after enough years, that whisper starts sounding like your own voice. If this idea resonates with you, I'd love to know your perspective. Do you think true strength is learning to carry everything alone, or learning when to let someone carry part of it with you? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this documentary is making you see yourself, or someone you've known for years, in a different light, leaving a like helps this channel reach more people who enjoy thoughtful conversations like these. But everything we've uncovered so far leads to one final mystery. If Generation X learned to trust patterns instead of promises, why did so many of them become fiercely protective of their privacy? Because the answer has nothing to do with being secretive, and everything to do with protecting something far more valuable: the self. There's an old psychological principle that almost nobody talks about. The more unpredictable life feels, the more valuable control becomes. Not control over other people. Control over yourself. Your time. Your emotions. Your choices. Your story. This is where privacy enters the picture. People often think privacy means having something to hide. But psychologically, privacy has never been about hiding. It's about deciding who gets access to your inner world. Generation X grew up before every opinion became content, before every mistake became permanent, before every emotion invited an audience. If you embarrassed yourself, life moved on. If you changed your mind, few people remembered. If you failed, you were free to become someone else. That freedom mattered more than most people realize, because identity needs room to evolve. The brain doesn't grow by getting everything right. It grows by making mistakes that don't become life sentences. Now compare that with the world we live in today. A thought is posted. A stranger reacts. An algorithm remembers. Years later, the internet still knows a version of you that no longer exists. To many people, that's normal. To many in Generation X, feels deeply unnatural. Not because they're afraid of technology, because they grew up believing something different. That not every part of your life belongs in public. That silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes, it's protection. There's something almost poetic about that. The modern world often tells us, if people can't see you, you don't exist. Generation X quietly learned the opposite. The parts of you that matter most are often the parts no one sees. Think about the people you've admired most. Was it because they shared everything? Or because there was a quiet confidence about them? A sense that they didn't need constant attention to know who they were. Real security rarely asks to be noticed. Insecurity often does. That's one reason many people misunderstand reserved personalities. They mistake silence for weakness, distance for coldness, privacy for secrecy. But those aren't the same things. A locked door doesn't always mean someone is hiding. Sometimes it simply means they've learned the value of choosing who gets a key. And isn't that what trust really is? Not opening every door. Choosing which ones are worth unlocking. That's why trust grows slowly. Not because the heart is stubborn. Because the brain is careful. It remembers every time openness was rewarded, and every time it wasn't. Every experience leaves a fingerprint. One broken promise may be forgotten. 10 broken promises become a worldview. One loyal friend may feel special. Years of loyalty become evidence. The brain isn't keeping score. It's building expectations. And expectations quietly become the lens through which we see everyone else. This may be the greatest misunderstanding about Generation X. People say they became skeptical. But skepticism wasn't the goal. Accuracy was. They weren't looking for reasons to distrust people. They were looking for reasons to believe them. There's a profound difference. One searches for flaws. The other searches for consistency. Generation X simply refused to confuse confidence with credibility. Because they'd already learned one of life's hardest lessons. Anyone can tell you who they are. Time tells you whether it's true. Maybe that's why some of the wisest people speak so little. Not because they have nothing to say. Because they've learned that words create impressions. But actions create trust. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. If our minds are built from patterns, if our personalities are shaped by repetition, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. Are we living according to who we truly are, or according to predictions our brain made decades ago? There's a question hidden beneath everything we've explored. Not, why did Generation X stop trusting the world? But, what happens when your brain mistakes adaptation for identity? Because that's what the human mind does. It takes yesterday's survival strategy, and quietly carries it into tomorrow. Long after the danger has disappeared, the child who learned to expect disappointment becomes the adult who struggles to receive love. The teenager who solved every problem alone becomes the parent who believes asking for help is weakness. The employee who watched loyalty go unrewarded becomes the leader who trusts systems more than promises. None of those choices feel deliberate. They feel natural. That's what makes them so powerful. The most influential beliefs are rarely the ones we consciously choose. They're the ones we stopped questioning years ago. Maybe that's why personality feels so permanent. Not because it cannot change, but because we mistake familiarity for truth. Think about that. How much of what you call who I am is actually what once kept me safe? That question has no easy answer. But it has the power to change the way you see yourself forever. Because awareness creates something the brain doesn't naturally give us. Distance. The distance to notice a pattern, before automatically repeating it. Perhaps that is what maturity really is. Not becoming someone completely different, but recognizing which parts of yourself were built from fear, and which were built from choice. Generation X reminds us of something every generation eventually discovers. Life doesn't simply leave us with memories. It leaves us with expectations. Some become wisdom. Others become invisible prisons. The difficult part is learning the difference. Maybe that's why the strongest people aren't the ones who never changed. They're the ones who had the courage to ask, does this belief still belong in my life? Because resilience isn't refusing to change. It's refusing to let yesterday make every decision for tomorrow. And perhaps, that's the lesson hidden beneath the story of Generation X. They didn't stop trusting because they became cold. They became careful. They didn't stop believing in people. They stopped believing that words were enough. They learned to watch patterns. To value consistency. To protect what mattered. Those lessons helped them survive. But survival and living are not always the same thing. At some point, every generation faces the same choice. Keep living by predictions written decades ago, or become curious enough to rewrite them. Maybe that's why you're still watching. Maybe this video was never really about Generation X. Maybe it was about recognizing a younger version of yourself, still quietly shaping the person you've become. And if that's true, then the most important question isn't, who taught me not to trust? Which parts of me are still waiting for evidence that the world can be different? Because healing rarely begins when the world changes. It begins when we become aware of the stories our nervous system has been repeating all along. If this documentary made you see yourself in a way you never had before, tell me in the comments. What belief about the world do you think your childhood quietly taught you? You might be surprised by how many people recognize themselves in your story. And if you enjoy documentaries that explore the hidden psychology behind everyday life, leave a like and subscribe. It helps this channel continue creating thoughtful conversations that stay with you long after the video ends. On your screen now is another documentary that reveals how different generations were shaped by experiences they never chose. Because when you understand how the mind is shaped, you begin to understand yourself.